A police K9's instinct led to a final miracle that will leave you speechless. Amid the deadly cold of the mountains, a police K9 named Alfa faced his greatest challenge. His sharp senses guided him through danger, leading to a rescue discovery buried deep beneath the snow. A small plane flew over high, snowy mountains. The sun shined brightly, but the cold wind was strong. The plane shook as the wind pushed it hard from side to side. Inside the cockpit, the pilot held the controls tightly. He gritted his teeth and tried to steady the plane. "We'll get through this," he muttered to himself, hoping the storm would calm down soon. The passengers sat quietly, fear on their faces. Some held hands. Others closed their eyes and whispered prayers. The plane shook again, harder this time. The wind howled like a wild beast outside. Luggage fell from the overhead bins, landing with loud thuds. A baby cried in the back of the plane, and a mother tried to calm her child. Then a loud noise came from the engine. It coughed, sputtered, and then stopped. The silence was terrifying. The pilot's eyes widened as he checked the controls. "Mayday! Mayday!" he called into the radio, his voice shaking. But there was no reply. The radio was dead. The engine had failed. The plane began to fall. Inside, screams filled the cabin. The pilot struggled to control the plane, but it was falling too fast. He pulled the emergency lever and shouted to the passengers, "Brace yourselves." The plane hit the side of a snowy mountain with a loud crash. The sound echoed through the mountains like thunder. The wings tore off as the plane slid down the icy slope. Finally, it came to a stop in deep snow. Broken pieces of the plane lay scattered around. Smoke rose into the freezing air. Inside the wreckage, there was chaos. Some passengers were bleeding. Others were trapped under broken seats. A young man tried to move, but his leg was stuck. He cried out, "Help! Please help!" Another woman crawled through the debris, calling for her daughter. "Anna, where are you?" She found the little girl under a seat and pulled her close. Both were shaking from fear and cold. The pilot, bruised but alive, struggled to unbuckle his seatbelt. He knew they were in serious trouble. They were in the middle of nowhere. The snow was deep, and the cold was deadly. He tried the emergency radio again, hoping someone would hear. "Mayday! Plane crash in the mountains. People hurt. We need help." His voice cracked. The radio sent out a weak signal before going silent once more. Far away, in a warm rescue station at the base of the mountains, a team of rescuers heard the faint message. The station buzzed with activity as radios came alive. "We have a crash report," one rescuer shouted. "A plane went down in the mountains. We don't know the exact location yet. We need to move fast." The rescue team leader, Captain Jones, gathered his crew. "Listen up. We got injured people out there. It's snowing heavily, and the temperature is dropping fast. If we don't find them soon, they won't survive." At that moment, Smith, one of the rescuers, walked in with his dog, Alfa. Alfa was a large, strong German shepherd with sharp eyes and a nose that could track scents even in harsh weather. He had once served in the police force but was now part of the rescue team. Smith knelt beside Alfa and stroked his thick fur. "You ready, boy?" he asked gently. Alfa's ears perked up. He barked once, loud and clear, as if to say, "I'm ready." Smith smiled and stood up. "Good. We'll need your help to find them." The team quickly grabbed their gear, warm clothes, ropes, and first aid kits. Snowmobiles waited outside, engines humming. Captain Jones gave the final instructions. "We'll split into 2 teams. Keep your radios on. Remember, time is everything." Smith and Alfa joined the first team. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit them like a slap. Snowflakes swirled around, making it hard to see. But Alfa didn't hesitate. He sniffed the ground, then lifted his head, ready for the mission. Smith followed, knowing he could trust Alfa's instincts. The rescue team set off, their snowmobiles cutting through the deep snow. The storm raged around them, but they didn't stop. Lives depended on them. Far ahead, the broken plane lay silent, buried in snow. Smoke from the wreckage was fading. Inside, the survivors huddled together for warmth, waiting for a miracle. They had no idea that help was already on the way. Alfa led the charge, his paws moving swiftly through the snow. His senses were on high alert. He could smell something in the distance, faint but there. He barked, signaling to Smith. "He's got something," Smith yelled to the others. The team pressed forward, their hope growing stronger. Time was running out, but the rescue had begun. The rescue team pushed through the deep snow. Their boots sank with every step, and the wind bit at their faces. The cold was sharp, cutting through their heavy jackets. Snowflakes danced around them like tiny white sparks, blurring the path ahead. Smith held Alfa's leash, but gave him some slack. "Go ahead, boy," Smith said softly. Alfa barked and ran forward. His paws left tracks in the fresh snow. He lowered his nose to the ground, sniffing for any scent of life. He was focused and determined. The other team members moved behind Smith. They walked slowly, their bodies heavy from the snow and gear. The cold stung their hands and faces. Captain Jones called out from behind, "Stay together. We can't afford to lose anyone in this weather." The team nodded and kept moving. Alfa led the way. His ears twitched as he listened to the sounds around him. The snow muffled everything. It was too quiet, except for the wind that howled like a wild animal. Alfa sniffed again, hoping for a clue. He did not give up. His job was to find people. Smith trusted Alfa completely. They had worked together for years. Alfa had saved lives before, and Smith knew he would do it again. Smith's fingers tightened on the rope tied to the team. He glanced back to check the others. They were tired, but they didn't complain. Suddenly, the wind grew stronger. It screamed through the trees and whipped snow into the air. The snow fell harder, covering the tracks they had made. Visibility dropped quickly. Smith could barely see Alfa, who was just a few steps ahead. "Alfa, slow down," Smith shouted over the wind. The dog stopped and turned his head. His dark eyes shined through the storm. Smith caught up and crouched beside him. He patted Alfa's head. "Good boy," he whispered. But the storm showed no mercy. The snow piled higher around them, and the wind made it hard to stand. "Storm's getting worse," one of the rescuers yelled. Captain Jones agreed. "We need to be careful. We could get lost out here." He signaled for everyone to tie their ropes together. If someone slipped or fell, the others could pull them back. Alfa shook his body, sending snow flying off his fur. He kept moving forward, but the snow began to cover his nose. He stopped and shook his head. The snow made it hard to smell anything. He pawed at the ground, then raised his nose to sniff the air instead. His body stiffened. He smelled something faint, something different from the cold and snow. Smith noticed Alfa's sudden alertness. "What is it, boy? Did you find something?" Alfa barked twice and moved ahead a few more steps. But the wind roared louder, pushing against them like a giant hand. The storm was too strong to continue. Captain Jones pointed to a rocky area nearby. "There! We need to find cover." The team stumbled through the snow and reached a small cave. It wasn't deep, but it gave them some shelter from the wind. They huddled inside, breathing hard. Smith knelt beside Alfa, who was shivering slightly. He pulled a thick blanket from his pack and wrapped it around the dog. He rubbed Alfa's back and whispered, "You did great, buddy. We'll keep going once this storm dies down." Alfa leaned into Smith's touch, his tail wagging weakly. He trusted Smith as much as Smith trusted him. The rescuers sat quietly, their faces pale from the cold. One of them lit a small lantern, casting a warm glow in the cave. "How long do you think this will last?" a young rescuer asked. Captain Jones shook his head. "Could be hours. We have to wait it out. Rest while you can." The wind continued to howl outside, but inside the cave, there was a moment of peace. Smith stared into the flickering light of the lantern. His mind drifted to the people trapped in the plane. Were they still alive? Were they scared and cold like his team was now? He couldn't let himself think the worst. They had to survive. Alfa lay beside him, his breathing steady. Smith kept his hand on the dog's side, feeling the rise and fall of his chest. "We'll find them," he whispered. "You'll lead us to them, just like always." Alfa's ears twitched at his words, but he stayed still, conserving his energy. Hours passed. The storm outside began to weaken. The howling wind softened to a low moan. Snow still fell, but not as heavily. Captain Jones stood and looked outside. Storm's easing up. Time to move. Smith and the others got to their feet. Alfa shook off the blanket and stretched. His eyes were bright again. He sniffed the air and barked, ready to continue. Smith smiled. That's the spirit, boy. Let's go. The team left the cave and stepped back into the cold. The snow was thick and uneven, but they could see farther now. Alfa wasted no time. He sniffed the ground and then the air. He caught the scent again. This time it was stronger. He barked urgently and sprinted ahead. Alfa's on to something, Smith shouted. The team followed quickly. Their hearts beat faster with hope. The search wasn't over, but they were closer now. Closer to saving lives. The rescue team pushed forward until they saw it, the wrecked plane. It was half buried in the snow, its metal frame bent and broken. Smoke no longer rose from it. The only sound was the soft, eerie whisper of the wind. Smith raised his hand to signal the others to stop. There it is, he said quietly. He took a deep breath. They had found the crash site, but what would they find inside? He glanced down at Alfa, who stood still, ears pricked up. Alfa sniffed the air, then looked at Smith as if he already sensed what was coming. The team hurried to the plane. Captain Jones shouted, "Check for survivors. Be careful. This structure could collapse at any moment." They moved quickly, but carefully. Smith climbed into the plane through a hole in the side. The inside was dark and cold. Seats were broken and tossed everywhere. Luggage was scattered across the floor. A faint voice called out, "Help, please." Smith followed the sound and found a woman huddled in a corner. She held a small child tightly in her arms. Her face was pale, and her lips trembled. We need help," she whispered. The child clung to her, too weak to speak. His eyes were half closed. "It's okay," Smith said softly. "We're here now. You're safe." He handed the woman a blanket and a water bottle. "Drink slowly. Keep your child warm." She nodded and did as he said. The boy whimpered softly, but when Alfa approached, his eyes widened a little. Alfa gently sniffed the child's face and wagged his tail. The child reached out with a shaky hand and touched Alfa's fur. For the first time since the crash, he smiled a tiny smile. While Smith helped the mother and child, other rescuers found more survivors. A man lay near the back of the plane. His face was bruised, and his leg was bent at an odd angle. He groaned in pain. "I can't move," he muttered. Two team members quickly assessed his injuries. "His leg is broken," one rescuer said. "We'll need to carry him out." They carefully lifted him onto a stretcher and covered him with a thermal blanket. The man winced but didn't cry out. He was too exhausted. Captain Jones checked on the progress. "We've got to move fast," he said. "Storm's not over yet, and we're still far from the extraction point." The rescuers handed out food, warm clothes, and medical supplies. People were weak, but hope returned to their eyes. They whispered words of thanks, though many could barely speak. Alfa stayed close to the child, letting him pet his fur. The boy leaned against him, feeling safer with the dog by his side. Then, without warning, the ground trembled. A deep rumbling sound echoed through the mountains. Smith's heart raced. "What was that?" he asked aloud. The answer came quickly. A loud crack echoed across the snowy peaks. "Avalanche!" Captain Jones shouted. "Run! Get away from the plane!" The rescuers scrambled to move the survivors. Snow roared down the mountainside like a white wave. It moved faster than anyone could react. Smith grabbed the mother's hand and pulled her towards safety. "We have to go," he yelled. Alfa barked urgently and tugged at the child's jacket. The boy hesitated for a second, then followed the dog's lead. Alfa guided him away from the rushing snow. Behind them, a wall of ice and debris slammed into the wreckage, burying parts of it under several feet of snow. When the avalanche finally stopped, everything was quiet again. But the scene was worse than before. Some of the survivors were trapped under the new layer of snow. Smith's eyes widened as he saw the destruction. "Oh no! We need to dig," Captain Jones ordered. The team quickly grabbed shovels and began to clear the snow. Every second counted. Alpha's ears twitched. He moved away from the others and sniffed the ground. He sensed something, a faint scent of life beneath the snow. He barked loudly and began to dig with his paws. Snow flew in all directions as he worked furiously. Smith noticed Alpha and ran to him. "What is it, boy? Did you find someone?" Alpha barked again and kept digging. Smith dropped to his knees and helped. The snow was deep and heavy, but they didn't stop. Alpha's nose told him that someone was alive under all that snow. Finally, they uncovered a hand. Smith's heart pounded. "We've got someone here," he shouted to the others. The team rushed over to help. Together, they pulled a man from the snow. He was barely breathing, his face pale and cold. "We need to warm him up," a medic said. They wrapped the man in blankets and checked his vital signs. He was alive, but just barely. Smith exhaled a sigh of relief. They had found him in time, but the danger wasn't over. The helicopter was still far away, and the storm could return at any moment. Captain Jones gave quick instructions. "We can't stay here. We need to move the survivors to a safer place. Let's get them down the mountain." The team organized quickly. They carried the injured on stretchers and helped the others walk. Alpha stayed close to the child, guiding him through the deep snow. The boy held onto his jacket tightly, trusting the dog completely. Smith looked around at his team and the survivors. They were tired and cold, but they didn't give up. The mountain had tried to bury them, but they had fought back. Together, they would make it to safety. With Alpha leading the way, hope stayed alive. The team moved carefully through the snow. They carried the injured survivors on stretchers. Some survivors leaned on the rescuers for support, their legs too weak to walk on their own. The cold wind howled softly, but the storm had passed. Smith led the way, with Alpha walking ahead of him. "Stay together," Captain Jones called out. "We're not out of danger yet." Alpha sniffed the air, his nose low to the ground. He searched for a safe path. The deep snow made the walk slow and difficult. The rescuers' boots sank with every step. The survivors shivered, their faces pale. But they kept moving. They had no choice. Suddenly, Alpha stopped. His ears stood up, and he froze in place. "What is it, boy?" Smith asked, watching the dog carefully. Alpha didn't move. His paws pressed into the snow, sensing something. Then, the ground trembled slightly beneath him. A cracking sound echoed in the cold air. Before Smith could react, the ice under Alpha's feet broke apart. "No!" Smith shouted, his heart racing. The crack widened, and Alpha fell through. His body disappeared into the dark hole below. "Alpha!" Smith screamed, dropping to his knees. He crawled to the edge and looked down. The hole was deep, and the walls were slick with ice. For a moment, all he heard was silence. Then, a faint bark echoed from the depths. "He's alive," Smith said, relief washing over him. Alpha barked again, but it was clear he couldn't climb out on his own. He was trapped in the icy darkness. "We have to get him out," Smith yelled to the team. He quickly grabbed a rope from his pack and tied it around his waist. "I'm going down. Be careful," Captain Jones warned. The other rescuers held the rope tightly as Smith lowered himself into the hole. The ice was slippery, and his feet struggled to find grip. He moved slowly, afraid of falling deeper. The cold air in the hole was sharp and biting. "Alpha, I'm coming," Smith called out. He saw the dog below, standing on a narrow ledge. Alpha's eyes reflected the dim light from above. He wagged his tail weakly when he saw Smith. Smith reached the ledge and crouched beside Alpha. He stroked the dog's fur. "Good boy. You stayed strong," he whispered. He wrapped another rope around Alpha's body. "Okay, let's get out of here." The team above began to pull. Smith held on to Alpha tightly as they were lifted slowly upward. The ice walls seemed to close in around them. At one point, Smith's foot slipped, and he almost lost his balance. His heart pounded in fear. But the team pulled harder, keeping him steady. After what felt like an eternity, Smith and Alpha reached the top. Hands grabbed them and pulled them out of the hole. The team cheered softly. Smith sat in the snow, catching his breath. Alpha shook off the snow from his fur and barked happily. "You scared me, boy," Smith said with a shaky smile. He hugged Alpha, feeling the warmth of the dog's body. "We don't have much time," Captain Jones reminded them. "The helicopter is coming soon." Minutes later, the distant sound of rotor blades filled the air. The rescue helicopter appeared over the ridge, its bright searchlight cutting through the fading light of the day. It hovered above a flat area, and a rescuer signaled the pilot to land. "One by one," Captain Jones shouted. "Get the survivors on board." The rescuers helped the injured and weak survivors climb into the helicopter. Smith lifted the child he had found earlier. The boy hugged Alfa tightly before climbing in, the helicopter's interior filled with warmth and safety. Smith turned to Alfa. "Come on, boy. It's time to go." But Alfa didn't move. His ears twitched, and he stared at the snow. He sniffed the air again, then suddenly bolted away from the helicopter. "Alfa!" Smith called after him. He ran to catch up. Alfa stopped a few feet away and began digging frantically in the snow. Smith knelt beside him. "What is it? What did you find?" Alfa kept digging, his paws moving fast. Smith soon saw a hand buried in the snow. His eyes widened. "There's someone here," he shouted. He helped Alfa clear the snow, revealing a man's face. The man's eyes barely opened, his breath shallow. "He's alive," Smith whispered in awe. The team rushed over and carefully pulled the man out. They wrapped him in blankets and carried him toward the helicopter. "You did it again, boy," Smith said, patting Alfa's head. The dog wagged his tail and barked softly. The helicopter waited as the last of the survivors climbed in. Smith and Alfa followed. The team helped them aboard and closed the door. The rotors spun faster, and the helicopter lifted off the ground. Inside, the survivors smiled weakly. A woman whispered, "Thank you," her voice filled with gratitude. The child hugged Alfa again, resting his head on the dog's back. "You're a hero, boy," Smith said as he gently stroked Alfa's fur. The dog sighed and closed his eyes. He was tired but happy. The warmth of the cabin and the soft voices around him gave him peace. As the helicopter flew away from the snowy mountains, Smith looked out the window. The crash site was far below now, but he knew they had saved everyone they could. It wasn't just luck. It was teamwork, courage, and the bond between a man and his dog. Smith leaned back and smiled softly. "Rest now, Alfa. You earned it." The dog didn't move. He was already asleep, his breathing steady and calm. The rescue was over, and they were finally going home.